Welcome to Mindtrip FM, your nightly historical haven. If our stories help you relax, fall asleep, or simply soothe your curious mind, please like, subscribe, or leave a comment telling us what kind of stories you'd like to hear. Now, let go of the day, close your eyes, and join us as we journey into a forgotten world. You might be shocked to learn this, but the Vikings, those fierce warriors you picture wielding axes on stormy seas, had a private life full of desire, passion, and intimacy. You would not expect their sexual culture to be so vivid, so intertwined with daily life, yet it was. In fact, sex was not just a private affair. It was connected to social status, family ties, and even religious belief. When we think of Vikings, we often imagine raiding villages or exploring distant lands. But they were human beings who loved, laughed, and desired. Marriage was important, yes, but it was not always rigid. Husbands and wives shared affection, but they also understood pragmatism. Alliances, children, and property mattered just as much as passion. And while adultery existed, it was regulated by rules, social expectations, and consequences. Viking society was flexible, but not without boundaries. Women, in particular, held surprising influence. A free woman could own property, manage households, and even influence marriage decisions. They could express desire, choose partners, and sometimes take the lead in sexual relationships. Their stories survive in sagas, where clever, strong-willed women outsmart men or pursue their own passion. The sagas reveal a society where female desire was acknowledged, if not always completely free from social rules. But what about pleasure itself? Vikings did not separate desire from everyday life. Physical intimacy was celebrated through humor, storytelling, and music. Songs and poems often describe love and lust in vivid, even playful ways. Sex was not taboo. It was part of life, woven into the stories they told and the songs they sang. They laughed at it, teased about it, and sometimes made it a form of entertainment, which helped them cope with the harsh realities of life on the northern coasts and icy seas. Even clothing and appearance played a role. Personal grooming, jewelry, and ornaments were not just vanity. They were expressions of attraction and desire. Vikings understood that physical appearance could signal strength, health, and vitality. Being desirable was a form of power, both socially and intimately. Sex and attraction were not separate from the rest of life. They were connected to identity, status, and survival. And so, when we ask ourselves, what was sex really like for the Vikings? The answer is complicated, full of humanity. It involved love, desire, humor, and social rules. It was dangerous, passionate, and sometimes playful. And most of all, it was real, woven into every part of Viking life. Now, let us take a closer look at male sexuality among the Vikings. Contrary to some stereotypes, Viking men were not mindless brutes when it came to sex. Strength and courage were important, yes, but sexual skill, patience, and attention to their partners were valued too. Sagas and oral traditions describe men who were remembered not only for their battles, but for their charm, passion, and romantic prowess. Viking men understood that intimacy was more than a simple act of pleasure. Foreplay, flirtation, and emotional connection were part of the experience. A man who could satisfy his partner gained respect, both socially and personally. This respect was a reflection of his ability to maintain harmony in the household, to be both a warrior and a lover. It was a delicate balance, but one that Vikings took seriously. And then there is the fascinating subject of sexual rituals and fertility magic. Viking society sometimes blended sexuality with superstition and spirituality. Fertility charms, herbal remedies, and even sacred objects were used to enhance desire or ensure conception. Some rituals involved playful sexual acts intended to bless the household, increase the harvest, or protect loved ones. For the Vikings, sex was not merely physical, it was part of a larger web of life, luck, and survival. Polygamy existed in Viking culture, but it was mostly limited to the wealthy or powerful. A chieftain might have multiple wives or concubines, but this was a marker of status, not mere indulgence. In ordinary households, monogamy was more common, and the emotional bonds between husband and wife could be profound. The Vikings knew that trust and loyalty mattered, even in a culture that celebrated boldness and freedom. Now, let us not forget the more taboo aspects of Viking sexuality. Yes, there were boundaries, and some acts were frowned upon or punished. Rape, for instance, was condemned, but the lines were defined by honor, social expectation, and the concept of ownership within marriage. While modern sensibilities may differ, it is important to understand the Viking perspective. Consent, reputation, and societal norms shaped the way sexual behavior was judged. Another surprising aspect is same-sex relationships. While historical records are sparse, some evidence suggests that sexual bonds between men or women existed and were sometimes recognized within certain contexts. These relationships were not necessarily stigmatized, but like all sexual behavior, they were intertwined with honor, loyalty, and social norms. Viking sexuality was complex, multifaceted, and defied simple categorization. And now, let us talk about the physical spaces once again. You might imagine sex taking place in a dimly lit wooden hut, but Vikings were resourceful. They used the landscape creatively. Forests, meadows, and riverbanks became intimate spaces. The changing seasons added varieties. Summer nights were long and warm, allowing for adventurous encounters, while winter nights demanded warmth and close body contact. Nature itself played a role in intimacy, connecting human desire to the wider world around them. There is also the element of playfulness. Vikings loved storytelling, humor, and theatricality, and this extended to their sexual lives. Teasing, games, and flirtatious competitions were part of foreplay. Humor could enhance attraction, release tension, and strengthen bonds. Sex was serious, yes, but also joyful, a reflection of the Vikings' zest for life. Consider the role of alcohol and feasts. Mead and ale were staples in Viking culture, and these gatherings often involved music, laughter, and flirtation. A feast could transition seamlessly into more intimate encounters. Social gatherings were a space for attraction, negotiation, and expression of desire. Vikings did not separate pleasure from community. They intertwined them in ways that seem surprisingly modern. Finally, let us address pregnancy and childbirth. These were central to Viking sexuality because life depended on reproduction. Women's bodies were celebrated for their strength and ability to nurture. Men respected this, and sexual activity during fertility periods was sometimes emphasized. There was a profound recognition that intimacy was linked to survival, family, and the continuation of lineage. Sex, love, and life were inseparable threads in the Viking tapestry. Now, let us dive into the role of sexuality during Viking raids and long voyages. You might think that life on a long ship was all blood, strategy, and battle. But Vikings were human beings with desires. Even in the harsh environment of raiding and sailing across icy waters, sexual relationships played a role in maintaining morale, forging bonds, and keeping spirits high. Sometimes, long journeys separated couples for months, even years. Letters, tokens, or simple gestures could maintain intimacy across distance. Oral histories hint that passion was remembered, written about, and even celebrated in songs and poems. Viking men carried the memory of their partners with them into battle, and women did the same at home, waiting for their return. Desire was a thread that tied together home, love, and adventure. And yes, there were instances of sexual encounters outside marriage. Vikings were pragmatic, and during raids, they encountered other cultures. Interactions could be consensual, but they could also be exploitative. This is a darker side of Viking sexuality, and it is important to acknowledge it. Their society was not perfect, but it had rules, expectations, and consequences. Sexual behavior was often tied to honor, power, and reputation, even when morality was flexible. Viking sagas tell stories of love and lust, some of which border on the fantastical. There are tales of men wooing women with gifts, feats of strength, or clever words. There are stories of women taking initiative, seeking passion, or challenging societal norms. These stories are not just entertainment, they reflect a culture in which sexuality was respected, feared, desired, and celebrated. One interesting fact is that Viking sexuality was intertwined with physical strength and health. They understood that physical vitality was attractive and valuable. Regular activity, diet, and bodily care contributed not only to survival, but also to desirability. A warrior in peak condition was respected not just on the battlefield, but also in matters of the heart and the bed. Sexuality was another arena in which Vikings expressed their prowess and social status. And then there is the matter of sexual humor, which cannot be understated. Vikings loved jokes, puns, and Bodhi stories. Humor could serve multiple purposes. Entertained, it educated, and it allowed people to explore sexual desire in a playful and socially acceptable way. Sexual humor was part of daily life, and it reflected a society that did not treat sex as shameful or secretive. We also have evidence that certain sexual practices were ritualized. These could be tied to religious beliefs, fertility rites, or the desire for protection. Some acts were symbolic, meant to invoke luck, strength, or divine favor. While the specifics are sometimes unclear, the connection between sex, spirituality, and survival is unmistakable. Viking sexuality was integrated with life itself, not separated from it. Now let us consider intimacy in old age. Vikings lived hard lives, but sexual activity was not necessarily abandoned with age. Elders retained sexual agency, sometimes mentoring younger generations or maintaining relationships with partners. Experience and knowledge were respected, and older men and women were valued not only for wisdom, but also for their understanding of desire and relationships. Finally, let us address the legacy of Viking sexuality. What they practiced, valued, and celebrated influenced the stories and culture that followed. Their openness about desire, their integration of sexuality into daily life, and their respect for the interplay of power, pleasure, and intimacy were remarkable. For a society often remembered only for conquest and violence, Their sexual culture reveals a rich, human, and surprisingly modern aspect of their lives. Now, as we reach the conclusion of our journey into Viking sexuality, let us pause and reflect on what we have discovered. Vikings were more than warriors, raiders, and explorers. They were human beings with desires, fears, joys, and loves. Their sexual culture was woven into daily life, social structure, spiritual beliefs, and even the landscapes they inhabited. You might be surprised to learn how progressive some aspects were. Mutual pleasure, emotional connection, and respect for partners were all valued. Sexuality was not hidden or shameful, it was celebrated, integrated, and deeply meaningful. From the intimate exchanges in their homes to the daring encounters in nature, from playful humor to ritualistic acts, Vikings understood that sex was about much more than the act itself. Even in their myths and sagas, sexuality plays a vital role. Gods and heroes engage in acts of desire. Passion drives conflict and reconciliation, and tales of love are intertwined with stories of power and destiny. The Vikings were not afraid to explore desire in its many forms, to laugh at it, respect it, and honor it. Their understanding of sexuality was holistic, connecting body, mind, and spirit. Consider the lessons for us today. In a world that often separates pleasure from respect or intimacy from daily life, the Vikings offer a striking contrast. They remind us that sexuality is a fundamental part of human experience, deserving attention, care, and celebration. It is not something to hide or be ashamed of, but something to understand, embrace, and integrate into the broader tapestry of life. Finally, let us imagine walking through a Viking village at sunset. You can hear the laughter, the music, the chatter of daily life. Families gather, lovers steal moments in hidden corners, elders share stories and advice. The world is harsh, full of challenges, yet there is warmth, intimacy, and joy. Sex, desire, and love are threads that run through every aspect of life, binding the community together, connecting generations, and reminding us of our shared humanity. So the next time you think of Vikings, do not think only of battle axes and longships. Think of their songs, their stories, their humor, and their hearts. Think of the tenderness and desire that lived alongside bravery and adventure. The Vikings, fierce as they were, also understood pleasure, intimacy, and love in ways that resonate even today. In the end, what sex was really like for the Vikings is not a story of excess or brutality. It is a story of connection, celebration, and the full expression of what it means to be human. And now, knowing this, we can see them not just as historical figures, but as people who laughed, loved, and lived with all the fire and passion of life itself.